Hello and welcome to the Curator's Salon podcast. I'm your host, Geeta Joshi. Today I have with me artist Ghia Haddad, normally based in Dubai. She's actually joining us from the US. Ghia, welcome.
Hi.
We have known each other for a few years now. Can you share more about your work and it's mixed media using the female figure usually as a center focus, but also your inclusion of embroidery and textiles in that. Can you share more about it?
Yes, so my work generally addresses issues of erasure and representation. And at the bottom of this is the use of textile, because textile and fiber arts has historically been viewed as a women's activity, um, associated with domesticity and femininity, and so has been historically kept aside from the main center of the art world. And in recent years, feminist artists and artists who are fiber artists have fought for a space in the center of the art world and are succeeding. But what I'm bringing to the table is a non-Eurocentric approach to fiber art, which involves using embroidery and fabric as in addition to paint on my canvases. Um, to bring that point home.
And the big ideas in your work include femininity, the centering the Arab female often. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yes. So being a student in the West myself, when I went to school, I realized through studying art history that history of the world really does not mean history of the world when you're studying it in the West. It means the history of others as seen by the Western scholars. And although we're in a post-colonial world, there is still a very Eurocentric colonial look at who we are as Arabs and as Arab women specifically. And I can only speak from my own experience. I'm sure other African women and women from the East are experiencing the same thing in terms of representation in the art world and outside of it. But I will speak to what I know, which is Arab women in the art world. And the history of representation of Arab women in art started in the 19th century with the colonial excursions that went to control these places and took with them artists whose job was to record the place in the name of science and knowledge. And what they brought back with them was, the the fantasy dream of these, dirty old men that were dirty old white men that were going to quote unquote exotic places and fantasizing about their women and over exoticizing them and over sexualizing them and representing them in positions of subservience. And these are the pictures and images that remain of us and that were used as a starting point to discovering women from the Middle East and the Arab world. And so this is kind of what I'm bringing to the surface with my paintings, with my artwork, saying that in this time where we have global communication that is so easy through social media and the internet, we as Arab women, it is our responsibility to start speaking in our language and self-identifying rather than depending on these images that were brought back of us from the 19th century and still speak for us. And so these paintings that I produce are saying, this is a version of who we are, and we express ourselves in a different way, which is much more sensory. And I present my art as art you can touch, which shocks people a lot, because paintings in the Eurocentric tradition are things that are a bit idolized, where you put them behind glass to protect them from people throwing tomato juice at them. But what I'm saying is I come from a culture where we wear our art, where we sit on our art, where we eat our art. And so for me, art is transient. It's something you produce to express yourself, just like when you're talking to somebody. And therefore, in order to share it in a very real way, in the way that I have experienced it, for you to touch it is part of you looking at my art. And that is, I think, what brings me a little bit different, and puts me on a different platform than artists in the West who are working with fiber, who still work within that sense of art is something that once it comes out of the artist's studio, becomes something we have to stay away from, versus my art, which asks its audience to interact with it in a very sensory manner, which in itself comes from the culture I come from.
Yeah, that interaction, right? But making it very tactile, because I
Mhm.
know you recently showed at one of the art fairs in Dubai, and that was actually something that
The-
brought a lot of people onto your booth, wasn't it? That, they were able
yes.
to interact with it
Mhm.
and physically touch it.
Yes, my booth had a sign, a big framed sign on it that says art you can touch. And I actually had an interactive piece where people were invited to place things on my painting. And it got a lot of traction, basically because people are hungry for this. Part of democratizing the art world, making it less elitist, less pompous, if you want, is allowing people who don't consider themselves as people who understand art to interact with it and understand it and appreciate it without making them feel like you're bringing it down a notch. So, my art in itself is something that invites everyone to interact with it on whatever level they choose, which is part of also the culture that I come from, which is a very communal space. So bringing the Eurocentric version of the art world down from an elitist space to a more democratic, more communal sense, um, more communal centered space.
Love it. Can you share more about is it called the Bride series, or the one I
Yes,
mean? Yeah.
yes,
Share more
which
about
was
that.
yeah, which showed at World Art Dubai actually in May. Um, I started this series because I live in the UAE right now, and in the UAE, when you go to a wedding, it's usually at least 3 nights. Um, and every night the bride wears something different. And at the last night, it's the white dress. And the white dress is not something that, for example, the earlier generations of Emiratis would wear. Um, my mother-in-law, for example, had a wedding that lasted 7 nights, and her last night was a green dress. So I started thinking about the dresses, the wedding dresses in the world, and the tradition of the white dress and how that started, and to to bring the conversation to the table that says not every bride in the world dreams of the day she wears the white dress, although it is seeping into many cultures. Even the Chinese now, they have the red dress, and then at the last night they have the white wedding dress. Japan, other cultures, the European white dress, like the European culture, has made its way into the cultures that before did not use it. And so that was the theme of that series. And I produced 6 paintings, the first of which was the traditional European white dress with the lace veil. And from then on, I went to represent different brides, the Chinese bride, the Nigerian bride, the Palestinian bride, the Moroccan bride, and so on, to also let people experience firsthand the bridal tradition that is not the West, not the white dress that Victoria started, and that still survives. I mean, it's crazy for me that now we all have to wear the white dress.
Well, there's still choices, I guess, but this is, yeah, like weddings seem to go on for days and days now. Like, even, I mean, like, it's long been a tradition in Indian culture, but you know, I have a friend that's getting married in, I think in September, and then she has a second wedding. So she has her Nigerian wedding, and then she has another, I don't know what that one is called, like a formal wedding or something. But, you know, even these sort of celebrations are taking place over multiple kind of days and occasions.
And it's so rich. The culture of wedding dresses in the world reuses the textures and the fabrics that are used, the headdresses, the colors are something worth sharing, worth talking about and thinking about, especially if you're in fiber arts, which is what drove me to start the series.
Love it. And then one of the things I that's very recognizable in your work is how when you use textiles, if it's draped over the female figure, for example, they actually hang off the canvas, so they're not contained within the frame, let's say.
Yes.
You know, and again, this kind of sort of plays on that idea of like taking up more space, but also being more interactive with and not contained, you know, within a visual
Literally,
frame or a, you know, within the canvas
yes.
itself.
Literally thinking outside the box, literally coming out of the frame and into your space, into, there is this clean frame that we are all functioning inside of. And I'm trying to come out of it. Is literally what my paintings are exploring and expressing.
And what about decolonizing history? This is another one of your collections. Can you share some more about that?
Yes, it's one of my favorites actually, because it talks about history, and uh, I I portray three queens. They're portraits. The first queen is Cleopatra, the second is Al-Hurra, and the third is Zenobia. And what I'm trying to say with this series is these are three queens, three Eastern queens that were represented in Western art. You can when you look them up in art history, you can see a lot of representations of these three queens. And they are, again, represented in the Orientalist fashion, where they're always subservient, they're always over-sexualized, over-exoticized. And they were stateswomen, very powerful stateswomen. For example, Cleopatra, who was the last Egyptian pharaoh, is known because we know her story from the Western perspective. We know Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. We know Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra in Hollywood. And they are all love stories. She is known to the Western world as the queen who died for her love, who um, um, came and took Caesar from Rome, um, bewitched him, is how they saw her in Rome. And what she was doing essentially was what a lot of kings and queens were doing in Europe, which is marrying for political reasons. At the time when she married Caesar, Egypt was in bad shape. It owed a lot of money to Rome. And she found a way to solve that problem. And in her reign, Egypt was regained a lot of power and a lot of financial gains, specifically because she married Caesar. And when Caesar died, she maintained this by marrying Mark Antony. But at the time in Rome, she was not accepted, specifically because she was from Egypt. And so Pliny the Elder and all the historians um, portrayed her as this witch who came and who was exotic and who bewitched these two men, and it's all embroiled in sex and love. Whereas, and this is the image that remained in the West of her, that was taken basically from these history books that were not actually history books; they were political images of what the Romans wanted to portray at the time. And don't forget, at the time, Roman women were not in the public realm. They couldn't be part of the political life. They were in their homes, and there was this woman coming from the East, a queen who was meddling with with Caesar, and so they rejected her as well. So what the historians were writing was what the Roman public wanted to hear about her. And when Shakespeare came to write his play, these are the books that he went to for his information. And he wrote Antony and Cleopatra, and that remained as an image that Hollywood took much later and represented, as her as this epitome of the white woman in Elizabeth Taylor. The white skin that we saw bear in many of the 76 costume changes that remained in um, our optical, if you want, memory of Cleopatra. And so this is the image of Cleopatra that remains. The bewitching, exotic, over-sexualized woman. And I am saying she was a queen. She was a stateswoman. She brought Egypt back to power. And so I reimagined in my portrait what she might have looked like in reality. And I clothed her rather than portrayed her bare. And I made her darker, which is not an image that we are used to seeing of Cleopatra. The other queen was called Al-Hurra, which in Arabic means the free. And it is a Moroccan queen that is known in the West as the Pirate Queen. And she was the queen of a city-state on the shore of the Mediterranean at the time when the Portuguese and the Spanish were coming in their ships to occupy and loot that part of the world, Northern Africa. And so the inhabitants of these city-states at that time were defending their lands through naval war. And so they all had ships and armadas that were fighting the Portuguese and the Spanish. The European accounts that remain of these cultures are pirates, because they were fighting the Portuguese and the Spanish in naval war. So they were known as pirates. And Al-Hurra was the first woman, and she's called Al-Hurra. She's known as Al-Hurra because she was one of the first women who was the leader of a state, basically. So she was given this name, meaning that she was ruling free of a man. And there are a lot of paintings that show the pirate queen from Morocco as a pirate with, a bandana on a ship with a sword. And that is not at all what she looked like. She never was part of the actual fighting. She never got on a ship with a sword. She was ruling from her castle or whatever she was if she was living, like any king or queen at the time. But what remains, the image that remains of her in visual culture, in European visual culture, is the pirate queen. Just like the country I live in right now, which is the UAE, they were known to the British as the coast of pirates. If you look at a map from the 19th century drawn by the British of the Gulf, you will see the coast of pirates, because the people of Ras Al Khaimah, which is one of the 7 Emirates, were fighting the British on the shores, fighting the British incursions on the shores of the current UAE, and were known as pirates. And so, in that tradition, the maps that were drawn at that time was the coast of pirates. So for anyone who doesn't see the alternative history, they will think that, oh yeah, these were historically pirates, like Al-Hurra was historically a pirate. And so I reimagine Al-Hurra not on a ship, not in a bandana, not with a sword, but as a woman of her stature would have looked at that time, with the clothing of the time, and the image that she would have had to her people. Same thing with Zenobia, who was a Syrian queen from Palmyra in the 11th century, who's notorious because she stood up to the Roman Empire. She came to power when her husband, who was the ruler he was actually in the Roman army, a general in the Roman army, and had control of Palmyra, and he died, and she took over. She started to rule Palmyra, which was a very rich city-state because it was on the Silk Road. And at that time, there was a vacuum in Rome, a lot of political turmoil, and there was no figurehead. And she took advantage of the situation and declared independence of Palmyra. And so when Rome gathered itself, they realized, look, this is what's going on in Palmyra. We have to quench this rebellion. And the Romans came, and there was a war, which she actually fought in, and she lost. So what remains in the visual culture of Zenobia for us is Zenobia walking in golden chains and tatters behind the Roman general that came back to Rome in a victory parade, which is what they used to do. So when you were victorious in an excursion outside of Rome, you would come back with all the slaves and the loot and a big parade and enter Rome. Uh, and we don't even know if that actually happened. Maybe she was killed in battle, maybe she was imprisoned somewhere. But all the images that remain of us is Zenobia in Roman clothes, in tatters, and golden chains. And all the written accounts of her are, of course, as always, when a woman is in power, they portrayed her, especially a woman from the East, as beautiful, this gorgeous, we don't even know if she was beautiful, but always, you have to be, if you're a woman and in power, you have to be a princess. So the long hair as visualized by Western artists, so fair skin, light hair, golden chains, Roman almost clothes, walking in vanquished behind the Roman leader. Uh, but in fact, if this was true, this was only the last part, the last stage of her life, whereas throughout her life, she was a very powerful, very capable queen dressed in Palmyran clothes, not Roman clothes.
So we kind of almost think of those Victorian paintings of those occasions, like you said, they were taken from older history books as like propaganda as well.
Exactly. That's what Pliny the Elder was doing, the historian from Rome, is he was writing propaganda. He was writing whatever suited their political power at the time. And these are the records that remain to us and that we've used. Basically, we use propaganda to inform our knowledge of what was going on, especially other cultures at the time. And that informed our knowledge of, specifically in that case, Zenobia and Cleopatra.
Amazing. Well, I'm going to go
Yeah.
back and look at your artworks, and of course, I'm going to add links in the show notes so anybody listening can tap through and see Ghia's work there. Ghia, you've been working on a master's in museum studies. I know you complete that MA this year. Can you share more about what you've been looking into?
Yes. So I'm at the stage where I'm writing my thesis. And I went into, I'm 56, so I'm going back into college at a later time in my life. And it's very energizing because um, I went back to my studio in 2019 when my youngest graduated. I had been doing community art when my children were younger, and worked in that through their schools in the community in Dubai to keep myself in the art world. And then when my youngest graduated, I went back to my studio and back to making my own art. Um, and so part of that was rediscovering how complex the issue of erasure and representation was in the art world, and how elitist the art world is, and how Eurocentric, like everything else in the world, how Eurocentric the basis and the origins of that world was. And I started thinking about the othering that you feel when you're in museums and galleries as a woman from the Arab world, because when you are, most of the time you're not represented. You're an anomaly, you're a mystery. But when you are represented, more often than none, um, you are the covered up woman who's in some way either subservient or exploited miserable in some way or the other. And that's not who we are. So I started thinking, who sets this tone? How did this begin? Who decided what dictated representation? And so it all comes back to really how museums started, and the actual activity of walking up these steps into something that was the center of truth and knowledge, that somebody had decided was the center of truth and knowledge, and we all readily accepted. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that, being an artist, a woman artist from the Arab world, trying to navigate this very these very tumultuous waters. So I went back to school, and in fact, there was a lot of conversation in a lot of my classes about this, about the othering that happens and the shift that's happening in museums, that museologists are trying to apply to these huge structures of knowledge that were started in the colonial, actually pre-colonial age, but that were based on the empire, celebrating the empire, celebrating. They started because people would go to places in the world and annihilate them, kill everybody, take their stuff, bring it back, and decide we're going to educate the world about these people that we just killed off, and then house them somewhere. And that's how museums started. So museums started as an expression of violence towards other people, and that's fascinating to me because it speaks to the very art to the very message behind my art. And so now I'm writing my thesis, and I'm writing it about textile because this is what interests me. And the theme is how Palestinian embroidery started in rural Palestine. Earliest examples we have are from the early 1920s. Surviving examples, because textile does not survive very well. So probably women were embroidering way before then, but embroidering their own dresses. And how in 2023 and 2024, there were major exhibitions in Cambridge and Manchester of Palestinian embroidery dresses. So my thesis studies how rural folklore from rural Palestine, from let's say the 18th century, came all the way to become a major museum item in 2023 and 2024, which is crazy.
Yeah. So, I mean, when people were, so the 100-year-old embroidery, that was just people embroidering for themselves, like not for,
Yes. So
like
the
community.
tradition, yes, the tradition in these rural areas in Palestine was, as young girls, women were tasked to create their trousseau. And the more elaborate the embroidery was, the more luscious, the more beautiful, the more you were an accomplished woman. So you created your own trousseau. And then when you got married, there was the dress that you've been making for all these years that you wore, and so on and so forth. And there's a codified, very interesting codified visual language where if you are a new bride, you wear a certain dress with a certain type of embroidery. If you were a widow, that would be a different dress. And so it not only portrays the stage you are in your life, it also portrays your region, because people who were coming from regions where they planted oranges had motifs of, let's say, orange blossom flowers on their dresses, and people who were coming from traditions of planting olive trees had olive branches on their motifs. And so the dresses also created a map of Palestine, which in this tumultuous time stands as, if you want, proof that these people existed at one point in time and had a very elaborate and vibrant culture, visual culture, that stands today as proof of their existence, and a proof of that there was civilization there at that time that now is no longer, because these villages don't exist anymore.
Amazing. That's so
And
interesting.
another very interesting thing is how embroidery changed for these people, where they were embroidering for themselves to wear these dresses. And then when they were displaced and became in refugee camps, they started embroidering for others because they used their skill, since they no longer had lands to plant. They started selling embroidery. So embroidery changed because you were no longer embroidering for yourself, you were embroidering for others to sell. And so it started becoming less passionate, if you want. And the visual culture changed because all the women now were in one refugee camp. So the orange blossom and the olive branch became one dress. And so you can trace the history of Palestine through these dresses.
And when you mentioned the shows in Manchester and Cambridge, were they in the context of other
It, it,
textile cultures or textile traditions,
this
or?
this major show was called Material Power. So it comes from the idea that we call any culture that is based on objects that become museum items from a certain culture is called material culture. And so, and it's very interesting in itself. It's a very interesting study in itself, because things that people used to drink from or sleep on or wear become curiosities. When you change their context, they carry with them a specific energy that changes when you put them in a cabinet for people to look at. And the show is called Material Power because it discusses the power that these artifacts hold in telling the story of a people by themselves. As I said, because they themselves speak of region, of time, timeline, just by being what they are. You can tell where they're from, who made them, why they made them. Did they make them to wear them? Did they make them to sell them? Where they were from, at what stage in Palestine's history did they come from? So that's the power that material culture will hold.
Oh my God, it makes me want to go back to a museum and like revisit it with, fresh eyes. Ghia, thank you so much. What have you got coming up for the rest of the year?
Right now I'm concentrating on finishing this thesis. Um, and hopefully after that, I have a series in mind that I've been thinking of for a while, which involves women shaking off fabrics. So taking this idea of fabrics and women and textile coming out of the frame to an even more advanced level, if you want, of women actively shaking off the history and the image in a very dynamic way. Because I've felt lately that my paintings are lack a bit of movement and additional energy. So this is what I'm exploring, hopefully, in the next
Love it.
stage.
Look forward to that. Ghia, thank you so much for being my guest. I am going to add links in the show notes for anybody that wants to follow Ghia on Instagram and your website. I will add in there. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I just want to say that I love that in your podcast at the end there's applause. I find that very cute. So thank you for putting that in, and thank you for giving me time to express.
Okay, now everybody can clap.